Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got another tag. You guys know I love Halloween tags, and I have one of the wallpaper stamps from Tim Holtz from years ago, and Stampers Anonymous, and I'm taking some dusty Concord distress ink over the top. It's got cling mount on the back, so I've just clung it, if that's a word, to my glass media mat, and then spritzed it with some water from a distress sprayer. The tag that I've cut out is using the Bookplates Alterations die. I believe there's like a thin lit version of this now, and I just sort of, an old school thing with backgrounds is to stamp it straight on, put your paper onto the stamp and then use your hands to stamp it essentially, instead of trying to get a good pressure from the other way around, because it's such a large stamp as well. So once I'd done that, I dried it off, and then I wanted more colour in the background without actually colouring it, so I spritzed it. Because this paper that I'm using is some watercolour paper, you can use mixed media paper, anything like that, it can handle the moisture. So I spritzed it and sort of tapped it and kept tapping it on the media mat so that I could get that water to move, and of course, being distress ink, it will always react, so and move with moisture. So I did that, and then I dried it off again, and I'm now going to work on the next bit, which is part of the bell jar alterations die. It's like a steel rule die, both of these were, and I've got the like pedestal bit, and I'm going to take some grit paste. This is distress grit paste. I love this stuff. My husband hates the feel of it, but I'm going to take some grit paste in the opaque, so it's not the, there's one called translucent, so it's sort of semi, like you can see a little bit through depending how thick you put it on, and I'm going to need a tiny amount of this stuff. Now I could have just slapped it on the pedestal, and that would have been fine, and I could have coloured it afterwards, but I took the walnut stain distress paint and put a few drops with the grit paste to colour it. It's not going to be as dark as the walnut stain there, because of the, I guess because of the white in the grit paste, but it gives a bit of colour. I could have also inked the pedestal first and then just used the white grit paste, and then inked and painted and done all the effects afterwards. So what I'm trying to do here is create enough texture in the background, like I say, with a bit of colour to start with, just helps going forward. But I want to give that sort of rust look, so you'll see later on how we get that sort of effect. It's new to me, but I love what it looks like, so I will keep practicing. That's the best thing you can do with any of this stuff, is just keep practicing. So we've got the first layer, which is texture and a bit of colour. I had leftover because there was obviously too much there for that little pedestal, so I just, as organically as I could, so I didn't want straight lines, I didn't want it to look like blocks of this grit paste on the what will essentially be my wallpaper in the background. I just, as organically as I could, spread it out over the rest of the tag. I'm not worried about the bottom bit either, because that I will do something with later, but that is essentially the ground for the pedestal in my little scene, if you like. So I used some of the grit paste in this bit to give it sort of some colour again, and make it look kind of like old wood, but that wasn't the original plan. I was just playing at this point. So just getting that on the edges, and then just getting the excess that might be over the other side of the, over the edges, just scraping that off. So for the next bit, I've got the Oddities and Ultimate Grunge stamp sets from Stampers Anonymous and Tim Holtz from ages ago. And there's this one, the Oddities has an eye in it, so that's one of the main things. And I'm going to take some Archival jet black ink and just stamp this in the middle. This is again the watercolor paper from Smith's, stamping it in the middle. The reason I'm using Archival on this card in particular, or this project, this tag, is because Archival it's permanent. So once I start messing about with it, which you'll see in a bit, I'm not actually it won't move that ink. That ink will stay where it is. So in the Archival coffee colour, so brown sort of colour, I'm using one of the Ultimate Grunge. It looks like a cracked glass. That's what it reminds me of. So I'm using that. And then I'm taking some, I believe this is antique linen, and going over the top. And you see when you use that, it doesn't move that ink. The archival ink stays in place, which is fabulous. And then just lightly in the center, I just wanted to color in the background. This is the bell jar part of the bell jar dies. And then I took some cracked pistachio and a smaller brush and just colored the eye. I figured the eyeball may as well have some color on it. Although, now that I think about it, the eyeball, that part would be white. But anyway. And then I'm using some, I just spritzed the same stamp, cracked stamp, with some water, and then sort of stamped it on there to lift some of the distress ink. But because it's not, it's more like a texture in the background rather than an actual image of that cracked looking stamp. So the next bit, I'm taking some old school, this is Cosmic Shimmer UT, it's ultra thick embossing powder. It looks like granules of sugar. That's how I kind of remember what different embossing powders are like. So if it looks like sugar granules, like regular sugar granules, it's probably an ultra thick. And I've just used a Versamark ink over the top of the whole thing. Now I'm not worried if the distress ink moves, but because I've used the permanent ink for the eye and the first lot of cracks, they won't move at all when I take that Versamark, which is a moist, clear, sticky ink, over the top of that. Whereas some of the regular distress ink, if you like, may have reacted. I wasn't worried about that bit. I just didn't want my main eyeball to move. So when it was dry, when I'd heat set it, I thought I was quick enough, but obviously wasn't. You can sometimes, if you're quick enough, you can actually, while it's still hot, you can add more embossing powder over the top and get the next layer going, but I wasn't. So I just re-inked it because it was cool enough with my Versamark ink. And I'm using just a coffee filter here. It actually turned out to be quite a handy thing because I could move that without touching the actual piece of card, without touching the bell jar, which was handy because that is like super hot. so just be very careful. And another tip, when you when you put this on, because it's so chunky, you don't want to flick it at all because you will just flick all of it off. So I would just slightly, like you've seen me there, I barely even tapped it to get the excess off. And actually with something like this, it doesn't matter if there's too much because it becomes almost like a molten lava kind of thing on your cardstock. So in the end, I did 3 layers of that, and you'll see what we're going to do with that in a bit. So back to the tag. Now the grit paste is dried, I'm going to take also in the Ultimate Grunge, there's like a brick design, and I just took that. I actually took it off the block because it was easier for me to stamp it this way. And I'm using that coffee ink again. Again, it's an archival, so it's not going to move once it's dry. And just giving some more texture and something in the background, kind of like old bricks. I was hoping that it would stamp nicely over the grit paste, but actually grit paste is so textured that it didn't really. So I just went with it in the background in general. But that was the idea, was that it looked a bit like exposed brick. And then again, another stamp that's in the Grunge, Ultimate Grunge, I used it in the jet black archival, and just stamped that on the bottom, kind of like a checkerboard floor. So at least now my image has somewhere to sit and it's grounded. I always think of that with certain images, is making sure that they look like they're grounded. I then took some Distress Concord, Dusty Concord, that I'd used in the background to stamp right in the beginning. I used that around the edges, but I will go back around the edges later on with some black soot as well, just to deepen that. I then spritzed the whole thing with some water with a distress sprayer, and then mopped up. Again, it just, all of this adds a bit of extra dimension or extra texture, or something in the background. So now we've got our 3-layered our UT bell jar, that's the word. And I'm just manipulating the paper. The paper curls slightly because of the heat and the embossing powder, and the more you move it and start to crack it, it cracks the ultra thick. So it's the coolest thing. So I did try and taking my distress crayons and trying to get them into the cracks. It's not that kind of, I mean, it kind of works here, you can see it a little bit, but it didn't work as well as the next thing I'm going to try. It's not like the crazing or the crackle from Tim Holtz. It doesn't work in the same way. So, but I wanted to get that colour into those cracks so you could actually see them. So to start with, what I did was I took the coffee alcohol Archival and stamped again, so it had sort of like, I was trying to get that depth thing again where I could see some of the cracks on the front and some that were behind or around the other side of the glass. That was the idea of the bell jar. But that, again, that didn't totally work. It sort of worked. So at this point I'm experimenting to see how I can get that colour into those cracks. Because when you touch it, it's smooth. It's super smooth. And then I grabbed my distress paint in Walnut stain, and I thought, well, let's just try this because it might actually seep into. So I literally just rubbed it all over. I wasn't worried that I couldn't get this off because I then took a baby wipe and just wiped over the top. The paint was still wet, so wet on wet you can get it off, and it worked much better. It went into those cracks, not all of them, but into a lot of them. And so I was really quite chuffed with that. So you can see, and I'll show you right at the end in a slow motion so you can actually see the cracks. It turned out much better than I thought. And also in the end, because of that slight layer, even though I'm cleaning it up here, there's a slight layer of film over the top which actually added to it, because old glass and old jars and things like that do not have that crystal clear look about them. So this actually worked out really well. So I was quite chuffed. But again, it was just an experiment, and I thought, well, I'll film it, and if it works, great. And obviously it did. So now we're going to try and do some rust effect. I've got rusty hinge and I've got cracked pistachio. This works so well. I actually wondered whether the rusty hinge was going to be too bright, but the more I used that and I'll bring some more walnut stain into it. It works perfectly. It's such a good combination. I mean, there's probably other colors you could use, but basically you want like an orangey color, a brown, sort of a deeper brown maybe, and also like this sort of patina, selvage patina, ironically, as a color. I don't have that yet, but that would work. But I had cracked pistachio, and this almost like brings it to life, makes it look more realistic. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it does. And so I do fiddle with this, and I do play quite a lot until I'm happy with it, because like the more orangey bits on the ends I wasn't totally happy with, so I just went in with my finger at this point and used the walnut stain paint over the top, and just kept playing around with it basically. So I have a regular paintbrush there, and I also have one that looks like a little fan, this funny little thing that I've got in my hand now. It's actually a really good brush for stuff like this, because it fans it on rather, and in like small teeny tiny streaks rather than in a blob of paint. So but even if you just had a wider flat brush as opposed to a round brush, that I think that would work as well, quite well. So I was really quite pleased with that. So now the rings for the top, I can't even remember the name of them. I actually used the Distress Black Soot embossing powder from years ago. I don't even know if they make this anymore, and it worked out quite nice. Gave it this chunky kind of gritty look, but you could get the same idea from your grit paste. And I used a Tiny Text Halloween, and this is actually a leftover piece of paper from a card from last year's Halloween. I think it was one where I made a moldy mantelpiece. I think that's something along the lines of what I called it. So it's a piece of the wood grain stamp from the same wood and wallpaper, so in the same set that the wallpaper stamp that we used at the beginning. And I just used a piece of that. I had it left over. I just used a piece of that. The colors worked. I thought great, and just stamped my image on there, my sentiment, and then just cut it down with a pair of scissors. Doesn't have to be fancy. This is kind of messed up anyway. And then just to make things stand out a little bit, because the although the pedestal of the bell jar looks really cool, it sort of blends in a little bit at the bottom of the tag because of all the other grit paste and things like that. So that's just note to self that, you know, watch the color the colors of the background and everything else. So I've spritzed again because I've inked everything with some Distress black soot, and then just spritzing just again for more texture in the background, and adds, you know, all those sort of layers add to it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry these off a little bit. And then I'm also going to add some foam. I thought that would lift it and sort of give it a bit of dimension, and also it brings it away from the background so that it's more visible. And so I'm just popping some foam dots, foam pads all over everything. I think I foam dotted everything. And then for the bell jar, obviously it needs to sit, well, the way I interpret it, it needs to, the base, the very bottom of it needs to sit on top. So I've got some flat double-sided tape, and the rest of it will be popped up on the background so it's level with the pedestal. And then what I'll also do, and you'll see this in a bit, is that I will add, because we're going from essentially warped cardstock as well, because we've been playing around with it, onto texture, you want something else. You want a wet adhesive to actually bond that. Now, I wasn't sure if my other adhesive would work as well, so I'm using some Fabri-Tac, which should work just fine and seems to so far. But ideally what I wanted to use was my collage medium, but I need to get that in a bottle. I actually have a spare bottle. I don't know if you've seen the little one that I use quite often. So I'm going to try and get some of that into that. I don't know how I'm going to do that. Or I might just buy a bottle of it for things like this, because that stuff will help stick anything. So I'm using Fabri-Tac just on a dot on the back of your foam. So that's just a helpful hint if you've got something that's maybe got more texture and stuff. It helps to stick it down and hold it. Especially like with these, they're all, you know, whether it's the embossing powder that we've used or the moisture that we've used with the inking and spritzing and texture paste, all that moisture sort of warps papers and things like that. So I then foam dotted the sentiment, which is going just across the front of the tag, and it says Her Immortal Beauty, and it's from that Tiny Text Halloween, and there's so many things in there that you could use for so many different things. So many sentiments. So this is it. It's super easy to do. I did play around with some of the, I guess, techniques, like the making something look rusty, but hopefully here you'll be able to see those lovely cracks that I got from the ultra thick embossing powder that I've genuinely had for over 10 years. Same as the Distress embossing powder. I've had that for many years as well. But hopefully you can get, in real life you can see it a bit better, but hopefully you get the idea of how to sort of create that rusty old patina kind of look on things. And if anything, if it doesn't look like that to someone, at least it's sort of got lots of texture and dimension, and that's the whole point, isn't it? So I hope you've enjoyed this, guys, and I will see you next time. Happy Halloween.